My daughter's teacher kept humiliating her in front of the class. I taught her a lesson she'll never forget. My daughter Lily had always loved school until she got Mrs. Thornton for second grade. The first week seemed fine. Lily came home excited about her new classroom pet turtle and the reading corner with bean bags. She'd spend hours at night practicing her spelling words and drawing pictures for her teacher. I thought we'd gotten lucky with such an enthusiastic start to the year. Then the red cards started. Mrs. Thornton had this system where kids got green cards for good behavior, yellow for warnings, and red for being in trouble. Lily got her first red card for asking to use the bathroom during math time. She'd raised her hand and waited, but Mrs. Thornton said she should have gone at recess. Lily wet herself a little trying to hold it and had to wear lost and found clothes the rest of the day. When I emailed Mrs. Thornton about it, she said children need to learn time management. The next week, Lily got a red card for helping another student with their worksheet. Mrs. Thornton said it was cheating, even though Lily was just showing the kid where to write their name. Then another red card for standing up to sharpen her pencil without permission. Another for sneezing too loud during reading time. By October, Lily was getting red cards almost daily for the most ridiculous things while other kids did the same stuff without consequence. But the real problem started with the public punishments. Mrs. Thornton would make Lily stand in front of the class and explain why she got a red card. A 7-year-old having to stand there while 20 kids stared at her, trying to explain why drinking water without permission was wrong. Lily started having stomach aches every morning and begging not to go to school. I scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Thornton, who told me Lily was too sensitive and needed to toughen up. She actually said maybe if I disciplined better at home, Lily wouldn't act out at school. I asked what acting out meant, and she listed things like humming quietly while working and wiggling in her seat. Normal 7-year-old stuff. I tried going to the principal, but Mrs. Thornton had been there 15 years, and he said she had her own methods that worked. The worst day was when Lily got a red card for crying. She'd skinned her knee at recess and was trying not to cry, but tears were rolling down her face. Mrs. Thornton made her stand up and tell the class that crying was for babies, and second graders were big kids. The whole class laughed while my daughter stood there with a bloody knee trying to apologize for having feelings. That night, Lily asked me if she was a bad kid. She said Mrs. Thornton told the class she gave out more red cards to Lily than anyone else this year. I decided Mrs. Thornton needed to understand what real consequences looked like. First, I started volunteering in the classroom every week. Mrs. Thornton couldn't say no because the school encouraged parent involvement. I'd sit in the back taking notes on everything. Not obviously just jotting things down in a little notebook with a smile. Mrs. Thornton would ask what I was writing, and I'd say just remembering funny things the kids said. But she'd see me write whenever she gave Lily a red card. It made her nervous. Then I befriended all the other room moms. We had coffee, talked about our kids, and I'd casually mention how stressed Lily was about all the red cards. They started sharing their own concerns about Mrs. Thornton's strictness. Soon everyone was comparing notes about unfair punishments. The mom gossip network activated, and suddenly everyone was watching Mrs. Thornton's every move. I also started sending the most cheerfully aggressive emails. Every red card got a response asking for detailed clarification about the classroom rules. If humming was disruptive, what about tapping? If standing without permission was wrong, what if a child dropped something? I'd CC the principal on every third email, just to keep everyone informed about classroom management. Mrs. Thornton had to spend hours responding to my concerns. The turning point was the winter concert. I volunteered to help coordinate and got myself in charge of the parent seating chart. I made sure Mrs. Thornton's biggest critics were sitting right behind her. During the show, I arranged for Lily to do a special introduction thanking all the teachers, except mysteriously forgetting Mrs. Thornton. When people asked why, I'd whisper about the red card situation. By intermission, every parent was side-eyeing Mrs. Thornton. Then came the class Valentine's party. I volunteered to bring supplies and showed up with everything in red. Red plates, red cups, red napkins, red decorations. I kept saying how much Lily loved the color red now thanks to seeing it so much this year. The other parents caught on and started making jokes about Lily's red card collection. Mrs. Thornton's face matched the decorations. The masterpiece was during Teacher Appreciation Week. I organized the class gift and suggested everyone write notes about what their kids learned this year. I helped Lily write hers, which said, "Thank you for teaching me that. Even when I try my best, it's not good enough, and that some people just won't like me no matter what." I made sure that card was right on top when Mrs. Thornton opened the gift in front of all the parents. The room went dead silent. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Mrs. Thornton's face turned bright red as she read the first few words of Lily's card out loud, her voice confident at first, but trailing off when she realized what she was saying. She shuffled it quickly to the bottom of the pile and tried to move on to the next card, but Michelle leaned forward with this sweet smile. She asked if we could pass the notes around, so everyone could read all the wonderful things the kids wrote. Mrs. Thornton's hands actually shook a little as she handed the stack to the parent next to her. I watched the cards make their way around the circle while Mrs. Thornton stood there frozen, her smile looking more like a grimace. Parents started reading, and their expressions changed from pleasant to confused to horrified. One mom covered her mouth with her hand. Another one glanced at Mrs. Thornton with raised eyebrows and then looked at me. The room got really quiet except for the sound of cards being passed around. Mrs. Thornton tried to laugh it off and said something about how kids have such interesting perspectives, but nobody laughed with her. The party wrapped up fast after that, with parents suddenly remembering they had places to be. Michelle caught up with me in the parking lot while I was buckling Lily into her car seat. She touched my arm and her voice was quiet but urgent. She told me her daughter Emma had been getting red cards for stuff that made no sense, like organizing her crayons during free time or asking to get a tissue. Michelle said she thought Emma was just having trouble adjusting to second grade and maybe being too sensitive. But after reading Lily's card and thinking about all the stories Emma had been telling her, she realized it wasn't Emma's fault at all. We stood there between our cars while the other parents drove past, and Michelle asked if we could meet for coffee tomorrow to talk about what was really happening in that classroom. I gave her my number, and we agreed to meet at the Starbucks near school at 9 in the morning. The next day I got there first and ordered my usual latte. Michelle showed up right at 9, but she had another woman with her. Michelle introduced her as Aaliyah and explained that she'd mentioned our coffee date to Aaliyah at drop-off that morning. Aaliyah's son was also in Mrs. Thornton's class, and when Michelle mentioned the red cards, Aaliyah practically begged to come along. We grabbed a table in the corner away from other people, and I pulled out my phone to show them photos of some of Lily's red cards. Aaliyah stared at them and then dug through her purse to show us her son's red cards from just this week. One was for breathing too loud during silent reading. Another was for fidgeting with his pencil during a lesson. Michelle pulled up photos on her phone too, and we spread them all out on the table between our coffee cups. The three of us started comparing notes about what our kids had been telling us, and a pattern emerged that made my stomach hurt. Mrs. Thornton had a group of kids she targeted constantly, while other children did the exact same behaviors without consequences. We decided right there that we needed to document everything our children told us about each school day. Aaliyah suggested we create a shared document where we could all add entries with dates and times and specific details about what happened. I left that coffee shop and drove straight to the school to schedule a meeting with the counselor. The secretary tried to tell me the counselor was booked up for weeks, but I said it was urgent regarding my daughter's mental health and I'd wait as long as necessary. The counselor found 10 minutes for me that afternoon. I sat in her tiny office surrounded by motivational posters and told her about Lily's stomach aches every morning and how she'd started having trouble sleeping. The counselor listened and took notes, nodding along like she'd heard this before. When I mentioned Mrs. Thornton's name, the counselor's pen stopped moving and she got this careful look on her face. She said she couldn't discuss other students due to privacy rules, but she'd seen several second graders this year with similar stress symptoms. Then she suggested I might want to talk to other parents to see if they had concerns too. The way she said it made it clear she was telling me something without actually telling me something. I thanked her and left, feeling like I'd just gotten confirmation that this was bigger than just Lily. That evening, Michelle called me and said she'd told her husband Curtis about everything we'd discovered at coffee. Curtis was on the school board, and Michelle said he was shocked because Mrs. Thornton had always gotten glowing reviews from the principal. She told me Curtis was going to quietly ask around with the other board members to see what they knew. 2 days later, Michelle texted me that Curtis had found out 3 other board members had received complaints about Mrs. Thornton this year. The principal never forwarded any of those complaints to the board like he was supposed to. Curtis was livid because the board was supposed to be informed about serious parent concerns, especially patterns of complaints about the same teacher. The following Monday, I showed up for my regular volunteer shift in Mrs. Thornton's classroom, but this time I wasn't just helping kids with their worksheets or organizing supplies. I was watching everything. I sat in the back with my notebook and wrote down what I saw with timestamps. At 9:15, Mrs. Thornton gave a red card to a boy named James for tapping his pencil on his desk. At 9:43, she didn't say anything when another kid did the exact same thing for twice as long. At 10:20, she gave Lily a red card for getting up to throw away a tissue without permission. But at 10:35, another girl got up and sharpened her pencil without asking, and Mrs. Thornton just smiled at her. I documented it all. The same 5 kids kept getting red cards while other children did identical behaviors and got praised or ignored. Mrs. Thornton kept glancing back at me while I wrote, and I could see her getting more tense as the morning went on. After class, Mrs. Thornton asked the kids to line up for lunch and then walked over to where I was packing up my stuff. She had her arms crossed and asked why I was really volunteering so much this year. Her voice had this edge to it that wasn't there before. I looked up at her and gave her my sweetest smile. I told her I just loved being involved in Lily's education and seeing how second grade worked. I said it was so interesting to observe different teaching methods and classroom management styles. Mrs. Thornton stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to figure out if I was being genuine or messing with her. She finally just said that was nice and walked away, but her shoulders were tight and she kept looking back at me as she left. I knew she understood that I was watching her now and documenting everything. She was going to have to be more careful when I was in the room. The pressure kept building over the next 2 weeks. Curtis reached out to Principal Holden and mentioned that the school board was asking questions about parent complaints. Suddenly, Holden agreed to meet with me, Michelle, and Aaliyah all together. We sat in his office with our folders of documentation spread across his desk. Holden looked really uncomfortable as we walked him through the pattern we'd discovered. We showed him the red cards with dates and times. We showed him our shared document with dozens of entries from our kids about unfair treatment. We pointed out that the same 5 children were being targeted while others weren't held to the same standards. Holden kept adjusting his tie and saying he was sure there was an explanation. But when Aaliyah asked him what possible explanation there could be for giving a 7-year-old a red card for breathing too loud, he didn't have an answer. He finally promised he would personally observe Mrs. Thornton's classroom to see what was happening. 2 days after that meeting, Lily came home from the school actually smiling. She talked nonstop through dinner about how great her day was and how Mrs. Thornton had been so nice to everyone. She said Mrs. Thornton didn't give out any red cards and even let kids get up for tissues without asking. I felt this sinking feeling in my stomach because I knew exactly what had happened. Mrs. Thornton had known about the principal's observation and put on a performance. She'd been on her best behavior to show Holden that everything was fine. That night, I sent an email to Holden explaining that Mrs. Thornton's behavior changed when she knew she was watched. I asked him to do unannounced observations since the scheduled one hadn't shown him the real classroom environment. I copied Curtis on the email so the school board would know I'd made the request. The following week, Mrs. Thornton retaliated. Lily came home with 3 red cards from a single day, and she was sobbing so hard she could barely get the words out. One red card was for her handwriting being too large and taking up too much space on the page. Another was for humming quietly while she colored during art time. The third was for taking too long to line up for recess. I looked at those red cards and felt rage building in my chest. This was deliberate. Mrs. Thornton was punishing Lily because I'd complained to the principal. I grabbed my phone and took photos of the red cards. Then I took photos of Lily's tear-stained face and her red eyes. I sat down at my computer and wrote an email with the subject line "Escalating retaliation against student after parent complaint." I attached all the photos and sent it to Principal Holden, the school counselor, and Curtis. I explained that Mrs. Thornton had given Lily 3 red cards in one day for increasingly absurd reasons, less than a week after I'd asked for unannounced observations. I said this was clear retaliation, and it needed to stop immediately. Then I held Lily while she cried and told her that none of this was her fault, and that I was going to fix it. The next morning, Michelle texted me that she'd run into Mrs. Thornton's sister in the teacher parking lot. Courtney taught 4th grade in the same building, and apparently she'd been waiting to talk to someone about what was happening. Michelle said Courtney looked nervous when she approached her, kept glancing around like she didn't want anyone to see them talking. Courtney told Michelle that her sister had changed over the past 2 years, becoming more rigid and angry about everything. She complained constantly about entitled parents who questioned her methods and problem children who couldn't follow simple rules. Courtney said she'd tried talking to her sister about being more flexible, but Mrs. Thornton insisted that kids today needed stricter boundaries and tougher consequences, or they'd never learn respect. Michelle asked if Courtney had noticed her sister targeting specific students, and Courtney went quiet for a long moment before admitting that yes, she'd seen the pattern. Mrs. Thornton would fixate on certain kids and find fault with everything they did while ignoring the same behaviors in other students. Courtney said she felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, but Mrs. Thornton was her sister, and she didn't want to cause family problems by reporting her. Michelle thanked her for being honest, and Courtney made Michelle promise not to mention where the information came from, because she still had to work in the same building. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Maya Simmons, a child psychologist that the school counselor had quietly recommended. I took Lily in the following week and watched through the observation window as Maya talked with her using dolls and drawing activities. Lily drew a picture of her classroom with herself standing alone in front of the other kids, and when Maya asked her to explain it, Lily said that's where she had to stand when she got in trouble. Maya asked how that made her feel, and Lily said scared and embarrassed because everyone stared at her. She drew another picture of herself with a big red card covering her whole body. After the session, Maya called me into her office and said Lily was showing clear signs of anxiety directly related to the classroom environment. She explained that the public humiliation and unpredictable punishment system had created a fear response in Lily that was affecting her ability to learn and feel safe at the school. Maya wrote a detailed letter documenting everything, including her professional recommendation that Lily be moved to a different classroom immediately for her mental health. She handed me the letter in a sealed envelope and told me to give it directly to the principal, and that she was available to speak with the school if they had questions about her evaluation. I scheduled another meeting with Principal Holden the next day, and brought the psychologist's letter with me. I sat across from his desk and slid the envelope toward him, telling him I was formally requesting an immediate classroom transfer for Lily, based on documented psychological harm. He opened the letter and read it slowly, his expression getting more uncomfortable with each paragraph. When he finished, he set it down and said that moving students mid-year was disruptive to their education and to the classroom dynamics. I leaned forward and reminded him that Curtis had already shared my concerns with the full school board, and they were very interested in hearing how the school planned to address a situation where a second grader needed therapy because of her teacher's behavior. Principal Holden's face went red and he picked up the letter again, reading it more carefully this time. He asked if I'd really go to the school board with this, and I told him I already had copies of everything, including Maya's letter, my documentation from classroom observations, and statements from other parents. He sat back in his chair and rubbed his temples. 3 days later, Principal Holden called me back to his office and said he'd spoken with Mrs. U. Smith, the other second-grade teacher, and she was willing to accept Lily into her classroom. But he needed time to prepare both teachers for the transition and make sure it went smoothly. He said he couldn't do it immediately because there were procedures to follow. I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar, counting out 7 days from that morning. I told him Lily would be in Mrs. Smith's classroom by that date, and if she wasn't, I'd be attending the next school board meeting with my full documentation and Maya's letter. I'd already confirmed the meeting date with Curtis, and knew I could get on the agenda. Principal Holden looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just nodded and said he'd make it happen. I thanked him for his cooperation and walked out of his office feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in months. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered it and heard Mrs. Thornton's voice, shaky and angry at the same time. She said she'd heard about the transfer request and wanted to talk to me directly about this situation. I stayed quiet and let her talk. She said I was trying to ruin her career over normal classroom management, that she'd been teaching for 15 years and never had problems like this before. Her voice got louder as she talked, saying that if I'd just disciplined Lily better at home, none of this would be happening. I felt my jaw clench but kept my voice calm when I finally responded. I told her that making 7-year-olds stand in front of their classmates and apologize for having feelings wasn't normal, and that giving a child a red card for crying when they had a bloody knee wasn't classroom management. Mrs. Thornton started crying and saying I didn't understand how hard teaching was, how entitled parents had made her job impossible. I said that calling parents entitled when they advocated for their children said everything I needed to know about her teaching philosophy. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt good about not letting her manipulate me into feeling guilty. The following Monday morning, I walked Lily to Mrs. Smith's classroom instead of Mrs. Thornton's. Mrs. Smith met us at the door with a warm smile and showed Lily where her new desk was, right next to a girl who immediately started telling Lily about the class guinea pig. I watched Lily's shoulders relax as Mrs. Smith explained the classroom routines in a kind, patient voice. There were no colored cards on the wall, just a chart with everyone's names and stickers for completed work. When I picked Lily up that afternoon, she was actually smiling and talking fast about everything they'd done. She said Mrs. Smith let them get tissues whenever they needed them, and didn't get mad when someone asked a question during instruction time. That night at dinner, Lily ate everything on her plate without complaining about a stomachache. The next day, Mrs. Smith sent me an email saying that Lily was a delightful student who participated actively in class discussions and followed directions beautifully. She said Lily seemed a little nervous at first, but was already making friends and adjusting well to the new classroom environment. 2 days later, Michelle called and asked if I'd meet her and Aaliyah for coffee. When I got there, they both looked exhausted and stressed. Michelle said Emma was still getting red cards almost daily and coming home in tears, and Aaliyah's son had started having nightmares about school. They wanted to know if I'd help them get their children transferred too. I pulled out my folder with copies of all my documentation and walked them through exactly what I'd done. I showed them how to document specific incidents with dates and times, how to request meetings with the principal, and what to say, and how to get their children evaluated by a psychologist if needed. Michelle said Curtis had already told her he'd support them with the school board, and Aaliyah was ready to fight as hard as necessary to protect her son. Within 2 weeks, both Emma and Aaliyah's son were moved to different classrooms. Then another parent I barely knew called me asking for help, and her daughter got transferred too. Principal Holden couldn't pretend anymore that this was just one difficult parent making unreasonable complaints. 3 more students had left Mrs. Thornton's classroom in less than a month, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Curtis called me one evening and said the school board had scheduled a special session to discuss the situation. The district superintendent was getting involved because multiple families had filed formal complaints, and the board couldn't keep handling it at the school level. He said Francine Guidry was reviewing all the documentation from every family, including my classroom observation notes, the psychologist evaluations, and the email chains with Principal Holden. Curtis told me that Francine had already told Principal Holden that his failure to address the complaints earlier had created a serious problem that now required district-level intervention. The principal had tried to explain that Mrs. Thornton was a veteran teacher with an established track record, but Francine apparently shut that down fast by pointing out that his job was to supervise all his teachers regardless of their tenure. Curtis said the next few weeks were going to get intense, but the district was finally taking this seriously. The following Monday morning, Mrs. Thornton didn't show up to the school. A substitute teacher took over her classroom and the office sent out a brief email saying Mrs. Thornton was on administrative leave while the district conducted an investigation. I heard from Michelle that the substitute was young and friendly, and the kids in that classroom visibly relaxed the moment she walked in. Parents started reporting that their children were suddenly enjoying school again, that the morning stomach aches and anxiety symptoms were disappearing. One mom told me her daughter had stopped having nightmares about getting in trouble at the school. Another said her son was actually volunteering to answer questions in class again instead of staying silent to avoid attention. The change was immediate and obvious, which made it even clearer how bad things had been with Mrs. Thornton. During the investigation, 2 parents of former students reached out to me through the school parent network. They said their children had been in Mrs. Thornton's class in previous years and had similar experiences with excessive red cards and public humiliation. Both families had complained to Principal Holden at the time, but he'd told them that Mrs. Thornton's methods were effective, and their children needed to toughen up and learn to handle criticism. One parent said her daughter had cried every morning before school that entire year, but they'd been told it was normal adjustment stress. The other parent said their son had developed such severe anxiety that they'd ended up pulling him out for homeschooling the following year. Both families said they'd eventually given up fighting the system and just tried to survive the year, but they wished they'd pushed harder. Now they wanted their experiences documented as part of the investigation to show this wasn't a new problem. I forwarded both families' stories to Francine along with all my documentation, and she added everything to the official investigation file. The district's review process took another 3 weeks while they interviewed more parents, reviewed Mrs. Thornton's personnel file, and consulted with the teachers' union about their options. Francine called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if I could come to her office the next day to discuss the outcome. I arrived at the district building and found Francine waiting in a small conference room with a folder thick with paperwork. She told me the district had decided to offer Mrs. Thornton early retirement instead of going through the termination process. I felt my stomach drop because it sounded like Mrs. Thornton was getting away with everything, but Francine quickly explained that they had more than enough evidence to fire her outright. The problem was the teachers' union would fight the termination and drag the process out for at least 2 years, maybe longer, and during that whole time Mrs. Thornton would either be teaching or collecting full pay while on administrative leave. With the early retirement offer, she'd be gone within 2 weeks and would never be allowed to teach in this district again. She'd also lose the chance to work in any other district in the state, because the early retirement would be noted in her file with the circumstances. Francine said it wasn't perfect justice, but it was the fastest way to make sure Mrs. Thornton never had another classroom of kids to damage. Mrs. Thornton accepted the retirement offer 3 days later. The school board met the following week to address Principal Holden's role in the situation. Curtis called me after the meeting and said it had gotten heated, with several board members demanding answers about why Holden had ignored so many parent complaints over the years. The board voted to formally reprimand him for failing to properly supervise his staff and for not documenting or forwarding serious parent concerns to the district level. Curtis told me quietly that Holden was hanging on by a thread, and one more incident of any kind would cost him his job. The board also voted to implement new policies requiring principals to keep detailed records of all parent complaints and to immediately forward anything involving potential harm to students to the district office. They created a parent liaison position at each school so families would have someone besides the principal to talk to when problems came up. 6 months passed and Lily transformed back into the happy kid she'd been before 2nd grade. Mrs. Smith's classroom became her safe place where she participated in discussions, helped other students, and actually looked forward to the school each morning. She still tensed up sometimes when she made mistakes on assignments and I'd catch her checking my face to see if I was disappointed, but her therapist said those responses would fade with time and positive experiences. I was grateful every single day that I'd fought instead of accepting that 2nd grade would just be a terrible year to survive. Other parents started calling me when they had problems at the school, asking for advice about how to advocate for their kids, and I helped them document concerns and navigate the system that had tried so hard to protect Mrs. Thornton instead of protecting children.